Gallup goes back a long time, founded in the 1930s by George Gallup, sort of the founder of public opinion polling. He got famous for calling FDR's election correctly. Our mission since then has been all about giving people a voice. How do we help people be heard in wherever they are, whether that's voters in America or, in the case of what we focus on in Concordia, really citizens all over the world. And we're doing that through what we call the Gallup World Poll, which is in its 20th year now. So we go out and we talk to everyday citizens in 140 countries per year. We do it the hard way in about 100 of those countries. That means we're going out and sending interviewers to knock on doors in rural areas, make sure that everybody really has the same probability of selection, which means that the survey is really representative.
I want to welcome everyone back to the Green Hour. We are here at the Concordia Annual Summit during Climate Week New York City. We're sitting down with Dan Foy, Principal at Gallup and Global Research Leader. Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So I think first question is, could you talk about what Gallup is and let's say the mission of the organization?
Yeah, so our mission, Gallup goes back a long time, founded in the 1930s by George Gallup, sort of the founder of public opinion polling. He got famous for calling FDR's election correctly, so that's what we're talking about historically. And then really our mission since then has been all about giving people a voice. How do we help people be heard in wherever they are, whether that's voters in America or, in the case of what we focus on in Concordia, really citizens all over the world. And we're doing that through what we call the Gallup World Poll, which is in its 20th year now. So we've got this really long-term trend on some really interesting items. And we go out and we talk to everyday citizens in 140 countries per year. We do it the hard way in about 100 of those countries. That means we're going out and sending interviewers to knock on doors in rural areas, make sure that everybody really has the same probability of selection, which means that the survey is really representative. And asking questions really aligned quite well with the Sustainable Development Goals to some extent. The sort of basic idea of how do we get beyond GDP and sort of traditional econometric measures of human progress and start looking at things like well-being, people's emotional lives, how they're getting access to basic services in their communities, what their financial lives look like, all of these kinds of topics, and then looking for ways to take the data we get from people and incorporate them into conversations like the ones happening here at Concordia.
Yeah, I think of it when we think of surveys, when we think of like technology, right? You don't think about some of these areas don't have access to technology, so you might have to go knock on doors to actually get the data. And if you want global data, that's kind of how you have to do it. I would ask, you talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, what's tied to the research, I guess, in the polls that you're doing globally with the SDGs?
Yeah, we've got a couple of really high-level examples. So first of all, we work with the World Bank to collect their Findex data, which is the official measure of financial inclusion, which is an official SDG indicator, asking people if they have a bank account all over the world, their access to credit, their ability to have money and resources to be able to pay for challenges that might arise with their family, to be able to save for the future, questions like that. We've also worked with FAO for a while, looking at food security globally. That's another one that's tied directly to the zero hunger objective within the UN goals. And then we've also done work with the ILO and Walk Free Foundation on trying to use the World Poll to understand a phenomenon like modern slavery. So forced labor, forced marriage in countries where that continues to be a challenge. And those are sort of the flagship, like true link directly to SDGs. UN endorses them as our official statistics. But in addition to that, we have all of these other domains that you could almost imagine as candidate SDGs for the future. So measures of things like loneliness around the world, measures of issues related to people's mental health, building upon the ones that I've already mentioned. So we ask about food security around the world. Well, what about what they're eating, the diet quality? What about water security? What about whether or not people are cooking and sharing meals with their families and getting enjoyment out of that? And so when we find domains like this, we really like to dive in with more and more partners to try and figure out how do we broaden the conversation, add nuance to what are obviously really big priorities clarified by the SDGs.
I mean, you talk about mental health. I think one of the big things we're seeing right now, especially with young people, is climate anxiety. And the stat that I have down is Gallup surveys show 61% of Americans express concern about global warming. What does rising climate anxiety reveal about how people experience environmental change?
That's a really great question, because I think we're starting to get into that period where 1.5 is not, we're not going to stay there. And we're really starting to see these impacts playing out. Your numbers for the U.S. are great. The thing I look at are the global numbers, and we've looked at things like in partnership with Lloyd's Register Foundation, we do a world risk poll asking people about their safety and exposure around the world, and we've used that survey to actually look at climate and disaster risk and impacts, and people's experiences of natural disasters strongly shape whether or not they feel prepared, whether or not they're concerned about these impacts. So we know that as disasters are becoming more frequent, this is something that's really top of mind for people. The other thing that's really interesting is we did a case study recently where we looked at the Amazon specifically, thinking COP30 is going to be in Brazil this year. We really wanted to look at countries bordering the Amazon. And when we dove into that data, one of the things that really stood out to me is looking at the way that Latin America and the people living in that region are really less confident with efforts to preserve the environment than people in many other parts of the world. And I think there's an interesting sort of maybe insight or irony within that data of people that are in one of the most environmentally rich parts of the world that are close to what's happening. We hear about the Amazon and its role in climate change all the time. They're the ones who are the most concerned, and they really think that their governments need to be doing more. So I think that direct experience of the impacts of climate change is something that's going to continue to make this more of a real live issue for people when they think about the most important priorities they want the world to deal with.
Yeah, it's interesting with the Amazon. We're actually doing a series with the Niche Conservancy right now called The Road to COP30. And what we've talked a lot about in that series is Indigenous communities and their value and their presence in the Amazon, and how when they're actually controlling parts of the Amazon, it actually performs better. So, I mean, that kind of leads me into asking a question on, you talked in the beginning about global data and how you might go out and knock on doors where technology is not present. Does Gallup go out in Indigenous communities and also try to get data from these groups of people?
That is a great question. You actually hit on a bit of a hot button there. So the Amazon specifically, and you're completely right, and the Nature Conservancy folks are great. I've chatted with them as well. The role of Indigenous communities there, you can't overstate it. It's so important, both the local knowledge and understanding of, just how do we know the ecosystem is functioning properly? How do humans and nature coexist? And I had a speaker the other day was talking and reminded us, humans are part of nature, right? We think we're outside of this, but we're all part of this system. The other hand, though, is for the kind of work that we do, surveys, it can often be really difficult to get those voices. And so the Amazonian communities are an example where Brazil's actually has done some really great work in protecting those land rights and protecting those communities and their way of life. As researchers, the challenge means is that we can't necessarily access those places. So being able to go and interview those populations can be a little bit trickier than trying to get to the general population. It's actually a point, I think if we did have that segment of the Brazilian population included in the survey, it'd be really interesting to be able to look at their opinions side by side with those living in more developed parts of the country, perhaps. Globally, we absolutely try and include everyone wherever we can, but Brazil's this unique case where there's a lot of protections in federal law around those communities that make them more difficult to do research on. When we ask about things like, if you ask about something like climate concern in a vacuum, and as you said, you've got a majority of Americans, and rates are higher around the world, certainly. Europe is obviously very concerned with climate-related issues, and we see that in the kinds of parties that are getting elected into the parliaments and into the representatives. And we know that those issues are more top of mind, more salient. But when you take issues side by side, that's where we start to see some differences there. So if we're asking people what their most important concerns are, it's almost always economic issues. Sometimes safety and security might rise to the top, but economics tend to be the number one thing that drive people. There's a famous quote about this, right? It's the economy, stupid, from US politics. It really holds around the world as well. I think the insight for this is we know those who are working on climate related issues know that this is an economic issue as well. And so I think making that message really clear that these aren't climate donations or commitments, these are climate investments. We're investing in resilience, that the money that's going into working on climate related issues is actually about how do you ensure that the everyday people who are being impacted are able to adapt, are able to thrive in the face of these challenges. And so turning this issue that can be more ideological or idealistic maybe into something that really hits at people's core needs is a really important way for continuing to drive that action.
And I guess help me understand too, because I see this data that you're collecting and publishing these statistics. What role do governments play in using this data and maybe implementing this data for future policies?
Yeah, we'd love to see them playing more and more of a role. There are places that are really exemplary in this. Some countries, Japan is a great example of a country where we've been working with a number of partners in Japan to bring almost the same level of data collection we have in the US to the Japanese nation. So we're doing quarterly surveys on well-being in Japan, and that's data is being reported actually in partnership with Nikkei. So the same way they're tracking their financial indices, they're trying to track their well-being of the community and trying to elevate those kinds of indicators into policy debates. We see other great examples. European Union sponsors oversamples of their member states so that they can get data not just at the national level, but really down to the local level so that they can see what local variation looks like within that space. And in an ideal setting, what we see is leaders are hopefully, one, listening. I mean, as I said, our mission is to elevate people's voices. This is a really good way to elevate people's voices. And sometimes the people that seek out communicating with their public officials or the people who are the loudest voices online or are getting into the media, they're not representative. This is sort of the whole point of Gallup is you have to actually go and also talk to the person who isn't going to speak up and voice their opinion because their opinion still matters. And sometimes you have to draw that out of them and bring that into the conversation. So we want to see leaders making decisions informed by what people's really priorities are, what their needs are, and then also using that data to determine whether or not their policies are having an impact. So if at the end of the day, government is about serving the people, and we have the measures of whether or not people are experiencing well-being, whether they're thriving in their lives. If government policies and changes are going into place and they're not seeing progress on that thriving metric, that core well-being metric, well, and then is that policy really addressing what people need? And so it's really about in the planning stage and then the evaluation stage, ideally, is what we want to see with government.
Well, it's interesting you brought up earlier the importance of the economics, right? And you said in these communities, a lot of times economics is the thing that people say is most important, right? What I see is with climate change, with these, let's say, climate disasters, when these things happen, the economics, people's pocketbooks are actually affected. So I think the environmental is so important because if we can figure out how to, let's say, curb climate change, then people's well-being, the economics are all going to benefit as well.
I think it's a really fascinating issue because, as we were saying before, it's about the climate, it's about the environment, but it's also about economics. And it's not just about, dealing with climate-related issues. It's not just we need to cut emissions. It's not just that we need to look at ways to help communities be more adaptive, but we also have to think about these other interesting aspects of the system, like risk and insurance markets and things like this. And we saw this really pointedly in the U.S., where we see in California and parts of Florida, insurers are pulling out because the risk of disaster is so high.
Wildfires in California.
Exactly. And we also know then when we talk about economic issues, now if you have an insurer who's saying, hey, the risk in this community is so high that I can't protect these people's property. And for most Americans who are homeowners, by far, the bulk of their wealth is tied up in their property. And so you have a scenario now where somebody's entire livelihood, everything they've saved for and invested for, is at risk because a financial services market is not able to meet those needs because of what's going on related to the frequency of these disasters. And so one of the things that really inspires me in the conversations this week is trying to learn from people who are leading in those specific areas and understanding the people who are doing financing around these things, the people who are insuring around these things. Just the same way we listen to the climate scientists who are monitoring carbon emissions in the environment, we have to understand that this is the kind of system that really requires all of these components to be working together in order for us to, as a world, truly be resilient in the face of what the world is going to throw at us in the next few years.
So what role do young people play in the data? And I guess how are people using that data to, inform decisions that they're making?
Yeah, I mean, just echoing what I said before, we really encourage leaders to be paying attention to that cohort. All the respondents are important. All those opinions matter. But that 15 to 24, that youth cohort, this is the next generation of leaders. These are the next generations of parents. These are the next generations of business owners, of workers in the economy. And these are the people that are going to shape the world that we have in the coming years. So it's critically important to prioritize that. The other thing that's really interesting to us, and our CEO was talking about this just the other day when it comes to young people and their well-being and their thriving, is because we've been asking these same questions for a long time, we're able to build up a sense of, are there life cycle patterns in the way people feel about certain things? And there's sort of this famous example of happiness. If we're looking at happiness or well-being and how people feel about their lives overall, is youth tend to be pretty optimistic. They tend to have pretty high well-being. Their physical health is really good. Their futures are bright. Everything's exciting. They're making these great connections, finding their place in the world. There's a lot going right. And then generally around the world, what we see is that as people head towards middle age, full adulthood, you start to, you've got bills and kids and the stresses of the world, you start having to go to the doctor more often, all these kinds of things. And people's stress levels go up, their well-being starts to go down. There's a lot of responsibility around that time. Later in life, then it starts to tick back up. And, I think a good part of this, I'm a big believer that there's a wisdom and there's a distancing with age as well, of people really taking things in perspective and maybe not worrying as much as they were. But also we know that there's a lot of things about getting older that lead to increased happiness. And so, and it's not your children, but it's your grandchildren. That's great for people's well-being. And so what we get is we know that this happiness follows this U-shaped curve over the life cycle, right? That's what we've seen historically. Recently, what we've started to see in our Global Flourishing Study, which is a longitudinal study that we've launched in partnership with Harvard and the Templeton Foundation and Baylor, that's hoping to really try and understand what are the other predictors that explain these kinds of outcomes, is we've seen this sort of distressing pattern where in a lot of countries, that U-shaped curve doesn't hold anymore. And it's not that all of a sudden people in their middle ages are ecstatic and we have a straight line situation here and everybody's happy all the time. No, what we're actually seeing is that young people are feeling more negative emotions, that their well-being is suffering, that their hope for the future is dampened. And so we know if their starting point is lower than it has been historically, and we know that the road ahead has challenges in it that are just normal to the human life course, well, does that mean that we're going to see this next generation have lower well-being as they're coming into leadership roles, and that they're really going to be maybe suffering in a way that prior generations weren't? So watching those kinds of numbers over time it's really fascinating. And I think there's important stories hiding in that data that we're going to see start to come to the fore in the coming years.
So final question I'll ask you, in the world, I mean, there's a lot of doom and gloom, right? You talk about the 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're far away from that, and we're not going to hit that number. You talk about global happiness levels. What can people be optimistic about right now?
Well, I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. I mean, the first one would be, you haven't asked me about AI yet in this conversation, which makes this like one of the few conversations I've had where that hasn't come up. And I'm not an AI expert or a techno optimist or a doomer or anything, but I do think that we're in this really interesting time of really significant change, and we're seeing really significant potential from, on the climate front. You look at the numbers and the trajectory on renewable energy. This is not going to turn around. Whatever happens over the next few years and economic policy, we are going to be living in a future in our lifetimes where renewable energy is the primary source of energy. That's going to happen. What does that mean when we start to see the impacts that does have on the environment? We may have missed the 1.5, but if we do see that we're starting to get that under control, I think there's reasons for hope still. And then also just technology, the ability of technology to connect people in different ways. There's so much potential here. So I think there's a lot of reason to be cautiously excited about that front. The other thing, though, we've talked about, I was just talking about the well-being and, how we're seeing this pattern changing. But when we started asking these questions in 2005. And by and large, what we've seen over the last 20 years is, despite conflicts, despite all the divisiveness and all the challenges that we know about, is that on the whole, the world is a somewhat happier place than it was when we started. People's well-being has gone up over time. We've also seen this on safety, which is obviously, the primary, when you talk about Maslow's pyramid, safety is the ground the pyramid is built on. You can't get anywhere if people don't feel safe. Again, we've seen this sort of slow, steady improvement in people's feelings of safety over time. Now, those gains aren't equally shared. There's lots of challenges. We just had a Cherry Blair up talking about women's equality and all the challenges that remain on that front. In 104 of the 144 countries we asked these questions, women are at least 10 points less likely than men to feel safe. So that's a problem that still needs to be worked on. And that's a problem in some of the most peaceful, developed countries on earth. But at the same time, on average, people are feeling safer than they were. And so we see some of these big picture, lofty ambitions that are linked to things like the SDGs, and safety is an SDG as well. And we see that the world is moving in the right direction. And so it sometimes feels like stumbles, sometimes feels like you can't get anything done. But we do see that there's progress on this. And so I'm really encouraged of what does that next round of progress look like? What does it look like when we see another 10-point increase on these metrics? And what does it look like when the world is able to say, okay, now we're ready to roll up our sleeves and tackle some of these other challenges that we know are out there that we haven't been able to give as much attention to because of the things that we've been focusing on to begin with. So overall, I would say, I think it's getting better. I think it's going to continue to get better despite all of the challenges and real suffering that still exists out there.
Well, Dan, we can't thank you enough for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks.
It's great to talk.